Dean Martin was in the middle of the biggest show of his career when a stagehand collapsed backstage and didn't get back up. What Dean did in the next 90 seconds didn't just stop a multi-million-dollar production. It changed how Las Vegas treated the people nobody saw. And Frank Sinatra, he watched it all happen and said Dean Martin just became the bravest man he'd ever known. It was August 1963. The Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. The temperature was pushing 108 degrees, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, and Sammy Davis Jr. were deep into rehearsals for the summit, a show that would become legendary. But on August 17th, something happened backstage that almost killed the entire production. Something that revealed who Dean Martin really was when the spotlight wasn't on him. The entertainment business in 1963 was ruthless. Not the glamorous kind you see on stage, but the real kind. Venues treated human beings like replaceable parts. Stagehands, lighting techs, backup musicians were invisible, expendable. If you got hurt, that was your problem. The show kept going and you either got back up or you got replaced. Dean Martin had seen it his whole career. He'd watched people get chewed up by the Vegas machine, but he'd never been able to do anything about it. He was a singer, an entertainer, a guy who showed up, hit his marks, collected his check, and went home. That's what everyone expected. Show up looking cool, sing your songs, don't cause trouble. But something was different about the summit. Maybe it was working with Frank Sinatra. Maybe it was the heat, the pressure, the intensity. Or maybe Dean had just reached a point where he couldn't stay silent anymore. Whatever it was, August 17th was the day Dean Martin stopped being just an entertainer and became something else entirely. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? The rehearsal was for the opening number. Classic Rat Pack stuff. They'd hired about 40 stagehands and technicians. Most were local guys working for $60 a day. Good money in 1963 if you survived the shift. One of those stagehands was Robert Chen, a 38-year-old former Navy electrician. He'd been doing stage work for 7 years. He had a wife, Linda, and 3 kids. Working with the Rat Pack could change a stagehand's career. Robert's job was straightforward. Operate the main spotlight from a catwalk 25 feet above the stage. The catwalk was narrow, hot, surrounded by high-voltage equipment. Standard Vegas setup. But wait, because what nobody knew was that the electrical contractor had cut corners. The catwalk's safety railing was hollow aluminum painted to look like steel. It looked identical to the reinforced version, but it was built to look good, not to hold weight. And notice this detail, because it's the reason everything that happened next became inevitable. The stage manager called places. Frank hit his opening line and Robert Chen leaned against the railing to adjust the spotlight. The railing gave way instantly. Robert's body lurched forward. He dropped the spotlight and it swung wildly. Robert caught himself on a support beam, but his shoulder dislocated with a crack. He was hanging 25 feet above concrete, one arm useless. Frank stopped mid-lyric. Sammy froze. Dean Martin saw it all. For 5 seconds, silence. Then everyone moved. The stage manager sprinted toward the ladder. The medic grabbed his kit. Dean pushed through and looked up at Robert hanging there, his face twisted in pain. The production supervisor, Vincent Moretti, appeared from the house seats. Moretti was the Sands budget enforcer. He looked at Robert hanging from the beam and said something that made Dean's blood run cold. Get a ladder, get him down, and get him out, and find out who signed off on that railing. They're done. No concern for Robert. Just get him out like broken equipment. The stage manager argued they should call the fire department. Moretti cut him off. We have 8 shows opening in 6 days. Every hour costs this hotel $15,000. Get him down and reset. Dean Martin heard every word and something inside him snapped. The quiet kind of snap, the dangerous kind. He walked over to Moretti, his face calm, his voice low. What hospital? Moretti barely looked at him. Sunrise, probably. Why? Who's paying? Moretti finally looked at Dean. Not our concern. He signed a waiver. These guys know the risks. Dean took a breath. So the Sands isn't covering his bills. The Sands provides on-site care. Anything beyond that is his responsibility. Now we need to get this rehearsal back on track. Dean looked up at Robert, still hanging, still trembling. Then he looked at Moretti and listened closely to what Dean says next. Because this is the moment everything changed. Reset without me. Moretti's face went red. Excuse me? I'm not performing another note until that man's bills are covered. The theater went quiet. Crew stopped moving. Frank Sinatra turned and watched. The pianist lifted his hands. Everyone sensed something big. Moretti tried to laugh it off. Dean, come on, don't be dramatic. The guy signed a waiver. Not anymore, it doesn't. Moretti's smile vanished. You have a contract. You can't refuse to work. Dean took off his jacket and handed it to a crew member. Watch me. Moretti stepped closer, his voice a threatening whisper. You walk out and you'll never work the strip again. The Sands will bury you. Every casino will bury you. Dean didn't flinch. Then I'm finished. But that man isn't losing his house because your crew used cheap railings. The silence was absolute. In 1963, performers didn't challenge casinos. One phone call, and you'd never work again. Dean knew this, but he was standing his ground. Moretti played his card. You're holding up 200 people. Dean looked at the crew. Then he said something that changed everything. And wait, because the response he got wasn't what anyone expected, not even Dean. How many of you have been hurt and paid your own bills? Hands went up. 1, then 4, then 15, more than half. Broken wrists, burns, falls, all paid out of pocket. Dean turned back. So it's not just Robert, it's all of them. Moretti's jaw tightened. This is business, not charity. Then be clear. Either the Sands pays every penny, surgery, rehab, everything, or I walk, and I'll tell every reporter why the summit shut down. The threat hung in the air. In 1963, casinos controlled the press, but Dean threatening to talk to reporters was dangerous. That could become a scandal costing millions. Moretti's face went purple. You don't have that kind of power. That's when Frank Sinatra stepped forward. He'd been watching in silence. Now he walked up and stood next to Dean, not saying a word. And notice what happens next, because this is the part that turned a standoff into a movement. The message was clear. Whatever Dean does, I'm with him. Sammy Davis Jr. joined them, then the musical director, then the head lighting tech. One by one, key members stood with Dean, silent, a wall of solidarity. Moretti looked around. He was outnumbered. If Dean walked, the show was dead. If Frank walked, the Sands would lose everything, and a public scandal about injured workers would be catastrophic. Moretti wiped his face. I need to make a call. He disappeared. Dean didn't move, just stood there, arms crossed. The crew didn't reset. Nobody moved. The production was frozen. Tens of thousands burning away, but nobody cared. Something bigger than money was happening. 35 minutes later, Moretti emerged. His face was neutral. The Sands will cover Mr. Chen's medical expenses, all of them, and we'll review our safety protocols. Dean didn't smile. I want that in writing today. You'll have it by tonight. And I want to know Robert's condition before we rehearse. Moretti nodded. Fine. Dean turned to the crew. Anybody want to keep working under these conditions? Speak up now. Nobody else gets hurt and left behind. Nobody spoke. The answer was written on every face. The stage manager cleared his throat. Let's take the rest of the day. We'll resume tomorrow once we know Robert's okay. As the crew dispersed, Frank Sinatra pulled Dean aside. That was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen. You just made yourself a target. The casinos will remember this. Dean shrugged. Then they remember it. I'm tired of pretending I don't see what's happening. Frank studied him, then extended his hand. You're all right, Martin. That night, Dean went to Sunrise Hospital. Robert was in surgery. His wife Linda was in the waiting room clutching a hospital bill that would have destroyed them. Dean sat down next to her. Mrs. Chen, I'm Dean. Martin, I was there when your husband fell. Linda looked up, eyes red. Is he going to be okay? The doctors are doing everything they can, but the Sands is paying for everything. Surgery, rehab, lost wages. You don't have to worry. Linda stared at him. What? How? Because what happened wasn't his fault. Linda broke down crying from relief. Dean stayed until Robert came out of surgery. 4 hours just being there, because nobody else was. Robert survived. The surgery repaired most of the damage, though he never regained full motion. He couldn't work catwalks anymore, but the Sands paid his bills, all $22,000, and hired him as a stage safety inspector. The summit resumed the next day. Dean was quieter than usual, but he was there. Frank watched him differently now, and the crew would have walked through fire for Dean after that. Not because he was a star, because he'd stood up. The casino tried to retaliate. Dean's next 2 bookings were canceled. The blacklist was real. But Dean had Frank's loyalty. He had Sammy telling everyone. And he had a crew that spread the word. Within a year, the story became legend in Vegas. Not in newspapers, the casinos made sure of that. But among the people who actually worked the shows, Dean Martin became something more than a star. He became a hero. In 1964, the Nevada Entertainment Workers Union pushed through new safety requirements. Casinos were required to carry comprehensive insurance for all workers. The change was directly influenced by what happened at the Sands. Dean never took credit, but everyone knew. Robert kept in touch with Dean for the rest of Dean's life. Every year on August 17th, Dean would get a card and would call them. Not for publicity, just because he cared. When Dean died in 1995, Robert Chen was at the funeral. He was 70, walking with a stoop, his left arm still not quite right. A reporter asked him what Dean Martin meant to him. Robert said, "Dean Martin saved my life. Not just that day, my whole life. He taught me you don't have to be powerless just because someone tells you you are. He showed me that standing up matters more than keeping your career." The reporter pressed. "But he was a big star. It was easy for him to take that risk." Robert shook his head. "No, it wasn't easy. He risked everything that day, and he did it for me. A guy he didn't know. A guy who didn't matter to anyone except my family. That's not a big star move. That's a good man move. And Dean Martin was a good man." The story of the summit is usually told as legendary entertainment, Frank at his peak, Sammy dancing, Dean showing he could hold his own with the greatest performers alive. All of that is true, but there's another story buried in that show, a story that didn't make it into press releases, a story about what happened when a man with power decided to use it for something other than himself. Dean Martin stopped a rehearsal on August 17th, 1963. He risked his career, his reputation, his future. He stared down a casino supervisor and refused to back down, and he did it for a man he'd never met, a stagehand named Robert Chen, who nearly fell to his death because someone used cheap materials. That's not just a good story. That's a blueprint for how to be human. That's a reminder that fame and fortune mean nothing if you don't use them to protect the people who can't protect themselves. Dean Martin wasn't a crusader. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was just a guy who saw something wrong and refused to pretend he didn't see it. The summit became one of the greatest shows in Vegas history, but the real heroism happened backstage, in a moment when Dean chose principle over profit, when he chose a stranger's welfare over his own career, when he stood up and said, "Not on my watch." And the crew that was there, they never forgot. They told their children, their grandchildren. The story spread through Las Vegas like wildfire, not in headlines, not on television, but in the places where real people worked, where being decent mattered more than being famous. Dean Martin made a lot of records. He performed in a lot of shows. He made millions of people laugh and feel something. But on August 17, 1963, in the brutal Vegas heat in a rehearsal hall that nearly killed a man, Dean Martin did something more important than entertain anyone. He stood up, he spoke up, and he refused to let the machine grind up another human being. That's the Dean Martin story that should be told. Not the cool guy with the cocktail. Not the Rat Pack singer with the effortless charm. The man who stopped the rehearsal and said, "Fix this or I walk." The man who risked everything for a stranger. Because that's not just courage. That's character.